Hey, students, welcome back. This is Aaron Rosari. This week, you had the opportunity to read a pretty clearly articulated argument by Louise Anthony on the problem of evil. What I've done in this lecture is instead of running through the specific reading questions, I've actually developed just a PowerPoint slide presentation that covers pretty much the same material, but I also discuss responses to the problem of evil on behalf of the monotheist. This objection to theism was raised, very early on, as early as the 2nd century and 3rd century. We begin to see theists such as Saint Augustine and Boethius trying to give responses to the problem. So in this lecture, I'll not only run through the objection to theism, the problem of evil itself, I will also overview two responses to the problem by the monotheist, and I will point out both the strengths and the weaknesses of those responses. Okay, and then I've set up a discussion board that you should proceed to after you're done viewing the lecture. So let me share my screen and we will get started with our discussion. All right. Well, it's not looking quite like I wanted it to. Give me a second. All right. And let me hit play. There we go. All right. So as you can see, I've entitled this presentation, The Problem of Evil. Just kind of a quick review or overview of what's happening in the argument. Right. Okay. So this is actually on your handout. The reading questions themselves. It's one way of formulating the objection to monotheism. Okay. So premise one, if God is all powerful, then God could eliminate all suffering. Premise two, if God is morally perfect, then God would eliminate all suffering. Premise three, but the world is full of suffering. So what can you do? Conclusion, there's not a God who is both all-powerful and morally perfect. Okay, so if you look at those two notes on the argument, uh, we're dealing in the argument with a very specific conception of God. It's the conception that is common to Jewish persons, Christian persons, and followers of Islam as well. There are many religions in the world that do not hold this specific view of God. There is actually a great plurality of views if you were to look at the various world religions. So this argument is only a problem, and by problem we mean objection, to Western and, of course, Middle Eastern monotheism. And definitive of that view of God is the idea that God is omnipotent, which means all powerful. Um, yeah, so that's just the Greek phrase, or roughly Greek phrase, for all powerful, omnipotent. Um, the other assumption about God made by Western monotheism or Middle Eastern monotheism is that God is morally perfect. And you can kind of go with in order to understand that claim, you can kind of go with your common sense notion of a morally good person, someone who's kind, someone who's fair, someone who wants and seeks the best for others. So this is often phrased, the objection is often phrased in terms of the idea that God is all loving. I just chose the phrasing in terms of God being morally perfect. But either concept could make premise two work. Okay. Another important thing to note about the argument is that it's what is called a valid argument. So if all three premises, P1, P2, and P3 are true, then the conclusion simply follows. So for the theist to avoid the conclusion, that there is not a God who is both all powerful and morally perfect. The theist has to actually cast doubt on or undermine one of the three premises. Now, in that note, I say the conclusion follows, hence a theist must refute P1 or P2. That's because I assume you'll agree with me that P3 is just obviously true. So unless you're willing to radically doubt our experience of the world, um, P3 is pretty safe. Suffering's all around us. Okay. So with that in mind, let's proceed. Okay, so a word I don't think appeared in Antony's article is this notion of a theodicy. And a theodicy is an attempt on the part of the monotheist to give reasons why God, so defined, would allow the suffering and vicious people who cause much of it to exist. Okay, so we've used the term evil. We call this the problem of evil. And and what we have in mind is suffering, and then also the evil motivations of people who cause suffering to others. Okay, so that's basically what we have in mind. Um, all right, now in regards to theodicy, uh, there have been two really filled out suggestions as to why, basically, if you go back, why premise one, no, not premise one, why premise two could be false. And so premise two is if God is morally perfect, then God would eliminate suffering. It's more common to attack P2 than P1. Um, and the soul making theodicy and the free will theodicy, that's what they do. They try to explain why even a morally perfect God might want to allow suffering because certain goods are achieved that would be impossible without it. Okay. All right. So let's look first at what is called the soul-making theodicy. Here's the basic idea. Many morally excellent character traits are of extremely high value. Hence, a universe which contains creatures who have these traits is better than a universe which lacks creatures who contain these traits or have these traits. And step two, these character traits can only be developed in a universe which contains great suffering. I forget my next slide. Okay, so let me just stay here for a little bit. Um, so two really good examples would be uh, compassion. That's a character trait. That's a morally virtuous character trait. And another one would be bravery. These are probably the two clearest examples of what the soul-making theodicy has in mind. So imagine a universe with no suffering. Well, there would be no opportunity in such a universe for one to cultivate compassion by aiding people who are suffering, because there wouldn't be any such people. Similarly, it would be difficult to cultivate bravery if there was no suffering to be overcome and therefore no dangers to be faced. So with these two examples in mind, just kind of read through steps 1 and 2 again, and you can kind of see what the soul-making theodicist or one proposing this idea has in mind. Okay, so having reread step 1 and step 2, it's pretty clear. The idea is that God has put us in a world full of suffering so we can develop these excellent character traits in the act of responding to the suffering around us, standing up to evil dictators, rushing into burning buildings to pull out victims, um, just genuinely caring for people who are experiencing various types of sorrow, again, the idea is these are great things for the universe to have. People who have these traits, and the only way to get them is to expose people to suffering. So that's the idea behind the soul making theodicy. And it has its strengths and weaknesses. So here's some strengths. It's actually plausible that morally virtuous persons are a significant feature of a universe. In other words, a universe with morally virtuous persons is better than a universe without morally virtuous persons. And it's also plausible that these virtues, especially compassion and bravery, that they can't really develop without struggles and pains to face. So these are considered strengths of the theodicy. But there's also weaknesses of the soul-making theodicy. Um, so here's a few. One, pain often destroys a person's psyche or renders them more vicious, in other words, evil, in response to their suffering. Uh, this is not a good account of the suffering that children face, because children are often simply overwhelmed by suffering, especially extreme suffering, and damaged by it. They don't have the strength yet to kind of often enough to adapt to it in meaningful ways by becoming, for example, more compassionate or more brave or more understanding and empathetic. It often simply overwhelms them. And this is kind of like a continuation of that first point. Even with adults, it's pretty common in the world for people to get too much suffering or get it in a way they're not particularly well suited to deal with. And instead of becoming more compassionate, for example, they might become bitter, they might become resentful, they might even become hateful. Think of the ongoing conflict, for example, in Israel and Palestine or Ukraine and Russia. Um, the danger there is you're just going to continue a cycle of hatred as opposed to building the virtues of compassion and things like that. And that happens all the time. So the idea is if you assume God put us in the world in order to cultivate these traits, well, they're not well proportioned. We often fail to do that. We are often made worse by our suffering and overwhelmed by it. And then, of course, some evil things that occur, like let's say a person gets murdered, well, there is no opportunity for that person to build character. They're simply going to be deceased. Okay, and we can add other weaknesses. For example, it only applies to human suffering, but not animal suffering. And animal suffering is part of the problem of evil. It's the suffering of humans and animals that the theist needs to account for. Okay. All right. So the other major theodicy is something called the free will theodicy. And here's the basic idea. Step one, it is a great good that humans have been given the freedom to choose between doing good and doing evil. Step two, God could not provide us with this good without leaving the door open for us to choose evil actions. Um, so on this online class, we actually didn't cover a topic that I actually do cover in my live classes, which is a discussion of freedom of the will. So briefly, on one theory of free will, you and I, given everything about our psychology, our upbringing, our genetics, our environment, we're still open in a moment to choose between competing options. So take a trivial example. So right now I'm recording this video and I could reach out and sip some lemonade, or maybe it's not the case that I had to do that, even given my desires and psychology. Perhaps instead I could have, refrained from drinking the lemonade. Now apply this to more significant choices. So one can either rob the bank or not rob the bank. One can either get into a fight and punch someone else in the face, or they can not get in that fight and punch someone else in the face. Um, so the idea here is having that choice between good and evil is a great good. It makes those actions authentically our own. We deserve real credit for them. That's the idea. And then that second step, okay, well, if God's actually going to give us the real freedom to choose to make these choices, then even God can't guarantee that we wouldn't make bad choices. So the possibility for choosing poorly is a precondition for having such freedom at all. And the freedom's so important, it's better that we live in a world where we have the freedom to choose between good and evil, and we often make bad choices, than it is to not have such freedom at all. So that's the free will theodicy in a nutshell. It has some strengths. So the main strength is that the freedom to choose between good and evil that actually can plausibly be said to be a tremendous good. And I'm using this, kind of qualified language so as not to beg any questions. Um, so without the freedom to choose between good and evil, as I just mentioned, we wouldn't deserve any credit for our good choices. And the value of our good actions increases since there was this real possibility we could have chosen otherwise. So I guess you could think of this as making those actions more authentically ours because we weren't locked in by our psychology to do them. We really could have done one or the other. Okay, now, yeah, I think that's good for strengths. So let's talk about the weaknesses a little bit. So here's a few weaknesses. In practice, we think freedom should be restricted in order to prevent great harms from occurring. So this raises the question. Let's grant that freedom to choose between good and evil is generally a good thing. But when we come to truly horrible things people do, their intuitions might flip. So, for example, this is an example I give in my live classes. I usually pick a student, let's say Gerald. I don't know. I say, okay, everybody, pretend that Gerald here, has a bomb, right? And Gerald stands up and he says to you all and me, hey, you know what? Thinking this through. I'm thinking of blowing us all up, and I'm also thinking of not doing that. And then I ask the class, what would your reaction be? Would you say, wow, this is a really good thing that Gerald has this ability to choose either the right way to go and, not blow us up, or choose to blow us up. And that choice is so important that we shouldn't interfere. Um, or do you think, actually, it's really horrible that Gerald is even thinking about blowing us up? And, if you had the opportunity to tackle Gerald, you would do that immediately. Now, phrased that way, I think you can get the point. None of us thinks the freedom to severely harm others is so good that it's worth the bad decision that could be made. We're constantly trying to shut down people who are trying to commit gross atrocities. Um, so it doesn't seem like the freedom to choose horrible things is actually a good at all. We're constantly trying to prevent people from having that choice. So that's a big weakness of the free will theodicy. Another weakness, uh, it's not clear that we have the kind of freedom this theodicy needs. Um, Something called causal determinism might be true, where all our actions are kind of locked in by our environment, our psychology. Um, if that's the case, then we don't even have free will of the relevant sort. There's a competing type of free will in the literature, but we can't really go into that here. But it might not even be the case that we have this freedom to choose between an array of options ever, because causal determinism might be true. All right. And the third point, This theodicy, the free will theodicy, like the soul-making one, has little to say about animal suffering, since animals are not moral agents. It also has little to say about natural disasters, things like earthquakes, disease, hurricanes, floods, famines. That's a whole nother source of suffering that has very little to do with human choice and human activity. So this theodicy is limited in scope, is the basic idea. Okay. Yeah, so that's the last slide. Um, it's a 101 class. Obviously, this is just an overview of the discussion. So I wanted you to get the logic of the objection to theism and then just kind of present some commonly asserted responses to the problem. It's generally conceded that these responses are not fully effective for the reasons given, but there are other things both monotheists, agnostics, and atheists have to say on the problem. It really has become a robust discussion. So this is just an overview to get you to see the logic of the problem and some moves that are made. All right. Yeah. So that'll be good for this week. Having viewed this, please proceed to the discussion board and I'll have you do some reflecting on the problem there. All right. Thank you.